Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. President Lee Jae Myung begins his second year with a sweeping vision, declaring 2026 the launchpad for Korea's great national leap. His New Year's message outlined 5 major shifts, including regional-led growth, expanding high-tech industries, and building a safety-first economy. And at the same time, nearly 280 new policies are rolled out, from tax credits and wage hikes to public service reforms. But as ambitions grow, so do challenges. The question now is, can the government turn these bold plans into real outcomes? For answers to this, we connect to Lee Hee-eun, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. A big welcome.
It's great to be back on the program.
Thank you so much. And also joining us is Junmo, professor at the Department of Public Administration at Konkuk University. Good to see you, Professor.
My pleasure.
So let's start with Professor Kim right away. Like I've said, President Lee is now stepping into his second year, and looking at what the administration has done so far, from consumer coupons to major investments in the AI industry. How would you evaluate the impact of these kinds of policies?
Yes, second year is important for any president in any country, because this is the time when the president should present one's own capacity to run the country. So in this sense, during his first year, President Lee tried to find a fine balance between domestic and international issues. Domestically, his attention was given to economic recovery of citizens by using consumer coupons, boosting future economic and industrial potentials by emphasizing AI. And internationally, he resolved trade talks with the United States, improved diplomatic relations, both with the United States and with China. So as a whole, his first year was quite busy one, and we could give very positive marks on that. So with this background, he's marching into his second year.
Right. And on that note, his New Year's address last week, President Lee actually declared that 2026 would mark the beginning of a great leap forward for the country. Professor Lee, how would you interpret the administration's priorities and overall policy direction for this year?
Right, it's a very ambitious plan for his proposals and priorities. So, as you mentioned, this is described as what he said, a great leap forward. So, which tells you that this is not sort of change at an incremental level. This is really transformational. And I think thinking through the 5 priorities he's listed out. So first, regional-led growth, basically moving away from a Seoul-centric, based economy to basically empower the local regions. But also we see this idea of inclusive growth. So not just focus on the big corporations, but the idea is for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, smaller businesses, that growth should not be just concentrated in a few, but distributed among the whole. And then we look at also this idea of culture-driven growth, right, with K-pop, with K-drama, K-culture generally, that basically to leverage Korea's capacity in those areas around the world. And then safety-based is sustainable growth. The idea that you have to have worker safety, workers and manufacturers, and then basically having sustainable growth throughout. And then lastly, this idea of peace-supported stable growth, right? Basically, the peninsula, of course, has been traditionally a source of great tension, but maybe instead of a risk, turning Korea into a premium, right? And so the idea here is we're not looking at just making small movement in terms of the transformation of the Korean society and economy, but really, as I said, transformational. It's really dramatic, and I think he's put forward a very ambitious plan for the future.
Right. And Professor Lee, you've mentioned the 5 national transformations that we're aiming for. So among these, I'm wondering, what do you think is the most urgent issue the government actually needs to address?
Right. I think, basically, I mean, one of the biggest things is sort of this regional, I think, distribution of growth, right? Because everything is based, as we all know, here in Korea, based on Seoul. And everything is centered in Seoul, education, culture, business, right? All of that. So in order for that to be achieved, I think for regional, more balanced regional growth, I mean, one thing that people have pointed out is there has to be greater fiscal autonomy given to local governments. I think what you see here is, with respect to spending in terms of overall, the regional areas represent about half of the spending when it comes to government spending. But in terms of revenue, right, most of that is based on the central government. And the central government has exercised a lot of control. So if there's going to be, I guess, this regional sort of base growth with respect to moving things outside of Seoul, it's not just simply investing in infrastructure, which is important, but also there has to be empowerment from the local regions, the regional governments, regional authorities, so that they can have more fiscal autonomy when it comes to making decisions. And that's a big deal because Seoul is such the central government too is so concentrated in power. In order to enhance local autonomy, they have to be able to spend the money in ways which I think, can be decided at the local level. So this is going to be a really big, I think, aspect of this in terms of, trying to implement regional-based growth, because that's a problem which many administrations have come into power saying that they want more balanced regional growth, but few have been able to really achieve it. So with respect to, President Lee, if he's able to pull this off, he'll do something which I think many administrations have said that they wanted to through rhetoric, but in fact, actually implementing it, I think, will be the real test. So I think that is, to me, the real big priority is more regional sort of growth with respect to the Korean economy, but also as expands into other areas, that there needs to be more people living in those regional areas as opposed to moving into Seoul.
Right, a very important point. So expanding greater autonomy for local governments would be very important. Now, staying with this topic, then South Korea is moving to, move industries such as semiconductors, AI, and renewable energy to local areas as well. Then, Professor Kim, what kind of conditions do you think are actually needed to build a real ecosystem for regional growth?
Yes, to have a vibrant regional economy, as you mentioned, is to have regional growth as an ecosystem, which rhetorics as well as in practical terms is to make dynamic regional clusters. To have clusters, we need energy, water, infrastructure, well-trained manpower, and deregulation. And this is a national issue as well as provincial issue. And that brings a caveat to find balance among and between provincial competition to have maximum visible outcome. And in this sense, President Lee's government announced the so-called 5 growth pole and 3 special zone policy. And in my view, as long as central government can ensure decent coordination, this will be the ultimate way to go.
Right. So it's really about building ecosystems, not just moving factories around. Now, the president also touched upon moving away from a growth model centered on big conglomerates and also instead focused on spreading economic gains to small businesses, startups, and the broader public as well. Professor Kim, then what kind of concrete policy tools would it take to make that actually happen?
Yeah, a healthy economy consists of large firms and small and medium-sized enterprises, and without one, the other will not survive in the long term. And while Korea's past policies have been focusing on a sizable number of small firms, our future direction will be the coexistence of the both large and small firms by not sacrificing one side. So having said that, our policy tools will include several things. First, we'll have to focus on intellectual property issues. We'll have to protect and respect IPs of small companies and new startups. At the same time, small companies will have to respect those established IP by the large companies. Second, we should help startups and ventures overcome so-called Death Valley or chasm issues where they succeeded in technology development, yet they cannot find commercialization opportunities that we should help. And thirdly, deregulation will be another policy tool where we have technology but no market. One example could be a fully autonomous taxi service, which we find in the United States and China. So in some sense, we can interpret this, our existing interest, dense network of interest, and together with regulation, is keeping this new trend coming into our scene. So with those policy tools, we can move forward.
So deregulation and enhancing mutual respect and protection from small and big companies as well would be important. But let's also touch upon the safety front as well. The government says it really wants to move towards growth that actually values life. Professor Lee, what kind of updates are needed in policies around industry, construction, or disaster prevention to support this kind of shift?
Right. I mean, we have a big new regulatory framework now with the Serious Accidents Prevention Act and the Punishment Act. And in that case, we have a new law that represents really a fundamental shift in terms of worker safety. And I think this represents, I think, a very classic sort of tension between, right, labor versus management. And here, in terms of the implementation of this new legal framework, we've had very active prosecutions of criminal actions against employers and management when it comes to the accidents that are happening at the workplace. And so, basically, since last year, the statistics were saying basically we had about 40 prosecutions of individuals with respect to this law in terms of accidents that happened in the workplace. But there's been some issues here because I think, as the law was going into place, many foreign companies as well as local companies, bigger corporations were very concerned about sort of the lack of, precision when it came to the law. There was not enough clarity with respect to guidance and guidelines with respect to, for example, what is proper safety look like? And because the law is subject to some measure of interpretation, there was a lot of worry and continues to be a lot of worry among management with respect to the application of these rules and sort of maybe potentially, blocking growth with respect to companies because of the huge risks that are involved with respect to the application of this law. So I think, one of the things that needs to be seen probably is clearer compliance standards. There has to be more, I think, clarity with respect to criteria for, management safety, and then questions about, what boundaries are with respect to punishment, because there seems to be at least some issues in terms of what the outer boundaries are with respect to liabilities when it comes to this law. So, and as well sentencing guidelines, because I think in this case, what happens when you have first-time offenders versus repeat offenders, there has to be some sort of, sentencing guideline in terms of judges and their ability to then impose punishments, and as well as, dealing with, companies in terms of establishing their own principles and guidelines in response to these rules. So I think it's going to take some time. And I think as the law works its way through, we'll see hopefully greater compliance, but also companies being able to adjust themselves appropriately so they can protect workers at the workplace.
Right, we will definitely hope for that. But for these reforms to actually put into action, there would be some resistance that we're expecting. So what kind of steps then can the government take to ease legal and institutional conflicts during this process?
Right. I mean, that's a really huge question because the government has lots of ambitious programs it wants to put into place. but it has to get the stakeholders right involved in communications with them. For example, when you look at the previous administration, the Yoon administration, they had a good goal, which was medical reform, and they wanted to increase the number of spaces in medical schools so that you'd have more doctors, right, in the Korean environment here, so that more people would have access to medical care. But there was a great resistance to that by the doctors and the medical schools and the students. And so as a result, because there was not enough communication between the government and the relevant stakeholders and people who were going to be affected by the law, there was not a lot of buy-in that was given by these groups. And then you face this resistance and this stalemate, basically, between, in this case, the doctors and the government. And so in order for these changes to really happen, you have to be able to, have the patience with respect to engaging the public, civic organizations, other people who are going to be affected by the law. And the irony is, even though the government wants to make these changes quickly, more patience when it comes to engaging these stakeholders is necessary in order for these rules to sort of take shape. We've seen now prosecutorial reform happening, right? That's been a conversation that's been having over the last 20 years. So right now we have the sort of the ground set forth where this reform can take place. But that required many years of engagement by the government as well as other groups, as well as academic society, sort of engaging this topic. So I think that's one big area which needs to be really thought through, is engagement if you want to have this sort of change happen at the governmental level throughout society. But there's lots of other things that need to happen as well. I mean, as well as, for instance, a regulatory impact assessment. How this is going to affect people, not just in the short term, but also in the medium term and long term. There's got to be a sense of how these regulations are going to have effects even beyond what the government expects it to have. And then it's going to have to be gradual. It can't be just dramatic. And I think this is where if you're too ambitious, it could backfire on you because the public can resist very strongly. So it really requires a lot of wisdom and patience with respect to the government in this case in terms of applying these changes to Korean society.
Definitely. So with this reforms, it will, of course, come with pushbacks, but how we handle it with patience and wisdom would be a very important issue moving forward. So we have been talking about this changes that are expected in the new year. Like I've said, nearly 280 policy changes are being rolled out, which includes a higher minimum wage and expanded tax credits. Professor Kim, what can the government do to make sure these kinds of changes are actually felt by the public themselves?
Yeah, all policy issues you raised are classical in the sense that every country faces. They're pivotal in the sense that they cut into the core. And it's possible to raise several policy guidelines or lessons to follow. First, a time gap issue. There's a time gap between policy action and the time when policy effects comes, while public and media have limited endurance. So governments should communicate frequently regarding what's happening and when the policy effect will come. And secondly, there should be a policy roadmap in each area to let people know what's ahead, when it will be implemented. Thirdly, it's crucial to distinguish between the issues that should go by the book approach and go by the incremental approach. So by following these several guidelines, President Lee Jae Myung government has decent policy mix and portfolio policies. So we may be expecting decent outcomes in year 2026.
Let's definitely hope for that. Now, finally, so considering both the major transformations the president outlined and the range of new policies that will be introduced in the new year, what kind of collaboration between the government and the people will be essential to turn these plans into meaningful results, Professor Lee?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is transparency and the ability to get feedback from the civil society. So, in terms of, for example, if we want to implement these policies, and again, because President Lee has a very ambitious priorities and plans in place, that really lends itself to be able to sort of engage the public. And so I'll give you an example. With the AI law that's been just put into place, basically you have a system where there's a 1-year grace period where you can see then how the law is affecting, relevant companies, the people. And then because of the grace period, you have this opportunity then to have refinements in the regulations, as well as, input from the people as well as industries with respect to how the law is taking shape. And so I think that's really one of the biggest things where you have transparency, but you have this feedback loop back to the government with respect to how these regulations are really going to be affecting society in practice. But also, I think you're going to also need, with respect to regional development, really active participation from the local government, but also people in the regions, because it's not just simply a top-down approach, right, with respect to how, development should happen. It has to be also bottom up. And so as a result, it can't just be the central government dictating policy and then, as funding these projects. It has to also come from the regional governments as well as, industries and people within those regions who actually know what's happening and what can, ideas with respect to how the growth can happen regionally, I think is something which is very important. Even though the government has its own policies and plans in place, it's the regions and the folks in the regions that are going to have to be really impacted and drive that growth. And then lastly, I think also you're going to have to see greater corporate responsibility, right? Because here, while you have a lot of big corporations who have been very, very successful, right, and they dominate the Korean economic landscape, right, they're going to have to sort of really be corporately responsible with respect to how they engage in business, and also consider, with respect to the effects of small and medium-sized enterprises. And the government needs to really protect them, but also encourage startups, because startups are, where a lot of this innovation happens. And, unfortunately, the big corporations can easily swallow up innovation because it can buy out these startups, and startups don't have really a lot of opportunities to grow and develop, organically. And so I think the government really needs to create an environment and protections for startups as well as small and medium-sized enterprises, so that this sort of balanced regional growth, but also sort of a distribution of that growth broadly beyond just the big corporations, can be effectively had in the Korean economy. So I think those are the three things that I would say are very important for this transformation to happen sort of in real time.
Right, a very important point to conclude our discussion tonight. Joint efforts between the government, the local governments, and the firms and the people are very crucial for bold changes to be held moving forward. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Lee.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Professor Kim, of course, we really appreciate it.
Pleasure is mine.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.